to another episode of Subject to Interpretation, the podcast for and about professional interpreters and the broader world of languages. I'm Maria Ceballos, and today we are going to be talking about why language is never just about words. It's about access, equity, innovation, and opportunity. So joining us is Amanda Seewald, Executive Director of the Joint National Committee for Languages and the National Council for Languages and International Studies, JNCL-NCLIS. Amanda is a lifelong educator, entrepreneur, and national advocate for multilingualism. Her work spans classrooms, Capitol Hills, and communities, all with a singular focus: ensuring that every American has a chance to learn and use more than one language. Amanda, welcome to Subject to Interpretation.
Thank you so much, Maria. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, we're very excited about having you here. You have, 25 plus years as a language educator. You also run your own organization, as well as have been involved with JNCL-NCLIS for many years, and now you are the executive director. Tell us about JNCL-NCLIS, and first of all, tell us how to pronounce it, and then tell us about it and how you came to be in this very important role.
Sure. Thanks, Maria. I always tell people that JNCL-NCLIS is the only organization that has two acronyms, and we say the letters of the first acronym, JNCL, and we sound out the letters of the second acronym, NCLIS, the National Council for Languages and International Studies. So we are an organization that has been around for over 40 years. We came about as the result of a commission under President Carter that brought members of Congress together to discuss the issue of study abroad, of really what is our capability as a nation with regard to language and foreign study, as well as understanding what our needs were. As a result of that, it was determined that there really needed to be a Washington presence that focused on language education and on ensuring that everyone had the opportunity to learn English and at least one other language. And that is exactly our mission to today. We exist because of that Carter Commission. And since then, we've brought language education advocates from all different parts of our field together to learn about how to be advocates, as well as to learn about legislation and to develop policies and legislation that would move federal money and federal policy around language education. That is what we've been doing for all this time and continue to do. We know that multilingualism in the United States is something that is still not considered a central part of education, and that's something that we really strive to change. We know that it is such an essential part of what our nation's needs are. So that's really what we do, and it's a combination of our membership, which our members, by the way, are not individual members, they're all organizational members. And we represent K through 20 education, as well as companies that are in the language space, whether it's language education through assessment or language education through publishing or interpretation and translation companies, or any other companies or organizations that have a vested interest in the value of language education. And the fact is that should be everyone, because we know what an important and essential role language plays on our national level, as well as in business and in nonprofits, and in really every aspect of our workforce. We work primarily with the federal policies, but we also support our advocates through state and local level issues. We do training for our advocates to make sure that they're well prepared and engaged, and through that, we have a national team of advocates in every state who care about our nation's capacity and about the opportunities, really, that all students deserve to have.
Now, you mentioned multilingualism, and of course, that is the core skill that an interpreter must have. They must be able to fluently speak one or two, well, actually two languages at the very least, if not more. So tell us why this work should matter, not only to interpreters, but why interpreters themselves are such an important part of your mission.
Yes, I think that interpreters and translators in particular really should care about this, both because of the way that it's about empowering the pipeline of interpreters and translators that exist to support the profession. But in addition to that, empowering their clients and the people they support through educational services, as well as healthcare services and all areas where interpretation is needed. One very important point about that, Maria, that I really feel is important for us to discuss is also the specialization that interpreters and translators need to really develop, whether it's in legal situations or medical situations or engineering or any other spaces where education, of course, where there are interpreting services or translating services needed. And truly, the professionalism of the interpreters and translators and their ability to be specialists is really dependent on the way that language education and education for the certification for interpreters and translators rolls out and continues to develop.
One of the things that I don't think receives enough attention is that teaching a language in order for it to be a tool to be used in interpretation are actually two different sets of skills.
Absolutely.
In addition, it's clear that teaching English to learners of speakers of other languages isn't done in the same way as it is done for little children who are just acquiring that as their native language. So it's really important that we actually talk about, I guess, the mechanics and the backbone of the tools that we use as interpreters and translators.
Yes, and advocating for those different educational specifications, those different opportunities is really a part of the advocacy that JNCL stands for. Language education in all of its forms, and that includes, and especially includes, that which leads to interpretation and translation certifications and specializations, as well as general language education, which, as you said so clearly, is very different from the specialization for interpreters and translators, as well as different for those who may be studying to be engineers or studying to be doctors. We know that there is such a need for multilingual talent in all areas of the workforce. All of that is dependent, of course, on the education opportunities that our nation right now does not provide in the way that it needs to. But what we do at JNCL is we stand in that space and we help draw attention to it through training our advocates and encouraging through the work that we develop with our partners in Congress to make sure that there is legislation and policy that will support the growth and the sustaining the way that we are able to move language forward in our nation. That is really important. Right now, it's about protect, sustain, and build pathways for growth.
I think it's important for our listeners and our viewers to get a sense of how broad and how broad the impact of language is in our society, in our culture, in our economy. And on your website, you have a very interesting series called Language at the Intersection. So what does language at the intersection mean to you and to JNCL?
Well, I have to say, just my involvement with JNCL has spanned almost 20 years now. I've been involved both as an advocate and then a board member and now as executive director for a very long time. And I care deeply for the tenets of what JNCL stands for and for the fact that as a parent, as a business owner, as an educator, I know that this is what we all need. And so developing the Language at the Intersection series was really at the heart of everything for me. And several years ago, we started thinking about how we needed to do exactly what you said. We need to be able to help educate people about the importance of language in all of these different sectors and all of these different fields. So language at the intersection is just that. What is an intersection? An intersection is when you come to a space where you have to make a decision, and each path you take gives you different opportunities. Well, language at the intersection began as just a theme, but really it was the impetus for a movement and helped redefine the way we focus on language education in our nation, and certainly through JNCL's advocacy. We started by interviewing multilingual professionals, as well as those whose jobs are facilitated by the essential involvement of interpreters or multilingual people. And we knew that those interviews would yield information and ideas that we could use as a part of our Language Advocacy Days video to kick us off that year. But what we found was that the conversations were so rich and deep, and really we discovered so many new ideas and experiences that people had through this, that we decided to build this into a full podcast series that we released and made free and open to the public for people to use in their classrooms, in their boardrooms, in any type of situation where it was necessary to explore where the intersection of language is in any specific career type. And that was, it's been really incredible. One of the things that we also did was we turned this series into a poster, a free poster that can be downloaded for classrooms, for academic offices, or anywhere where we want to make people understand visually, graphically, where these intersections lie, and they're everywhere. And this really helped us achieve our goal of setting the purposeful language learning into the focus of what we do. Understanding purposeful language learning, not thinking about things in terms of necessarily even fluency, but really proficiency and an understanding of how proficiency drives the way that we interact with content and language and ideas. And that's true, of course, for any field.
Now, is there a particular episode that maybe surprised you?
Well, I found that one of the episodes that really stood out to me was an engineer who spoke to us, and talked to us about how when he came to the United States, he was originally from Argentina, and when he came to the United States, being in many different spaces, he was just learning English at the time. So he was using his Spanish in some situations, but what he also found was his ability to speak Italian put him into different opportunities, different conversations that he might otherwise not have been in the construction and business settings that he was in. So I found that to be really fascinating. And I really just understanding how the culture of multilingual spaces, this is one of the things that he also shared, the culture of being in a space when it was multilingual for the workers, for the people who run the business, and for him, really vastly changed how he felt that he was able to do his work and how he felt that he could succeed. And I found that truly fascinating as we explored language at the intersection.
Now, JNCL frames multilingualism is critical to human rights, equity, and global readiness.
Mm-hmm.
Unpack that a little bit for us.
Sure. I mean, language is a human right. It is a human right, is a part of who we are. It is a part of the way we interact, and it is a vital building block of communication in all things that we do. So it is a right for every student to be able to learn language and to be able to be proficient in language. And for us, that is English and at least one other language. Thinking in terms of multilingualism as a global readiness piece is that we certainly, both domestically and globally, cannot exist and succeed without an understanding of how people interact. And that's really where language and culture come into play, because I think that's the other piece of this, right? Is how culture plays a role in this. This is exactly why interpreters and translators are also so important, because of an understanding of culture in scenarios that otherwise would be devoid of it. Specifically in medical situations, specifically in legal situations, and in the way that you interact with people. Being a speaker of multiple languages myself, I know that the way that we interact the way I interact in any language is definitely dependent on the way I understand culture as well. And so that is a vital component of it. And multilingualism can only exist when there is an attention to all of those pieces, whether it's a focus outward globally or a focus inwardly at who we are and how we interact with others.
Let's talk about preparation. You talked about a little bit earlier about proficiency and versus fluency. Let's talk about, where we are, let's say in the K to 20 scenario with regards to our ability to promote multilingualism here in the United States and some of the challenges that JNCL is having.
Well, I have to say, I'll start by just talking about it as a language educator, really, just from my perspective over the last 25 years, what we've seen, what I've done both as an educator and as a developer of language programs, as well as an advocate, is to really look at the fundamental ways that we learn language in the United States, which have changed over the last 20 years, for sure. It's not a grammar focused fluency model anymore. It is really, how do we achieve that level of fluent, proficient understanding across different modes of communication? How are we making sure that our learners are able to speak, are able to understand, are able to interact in real world scenarios? And how well are they understood? So part of that is a big change in the instructional strategies that we use across the United States for language learning. The additional piece of that is what our government, what our nation does with regard to the way we view language and, frankly, identity in language, right? And that's something that continues to evolve. And in some cases now, we face many challenges that are coming to us as a result of the current administration's perspective on language, on education as a whole, and the decisions being made there. But I think that really JNCL has always faced the same challenge, and that is that although we are a multilingual nation in the United States has never honored its multilingualism through education from a K through 20 perspective. It's never been, as I said earlier, in that central part. It's not, no one would ever consider stopping the teaching of math, but stopping the teaching of language is something that happens regularly, whether it's K through 5 or middle school or high school or even beyond at the university level. It's not required everywhere, and the requirements vary so much. It's really just something that our nation grapples with and continues to grapple with every day. And so, of course, that's where JNCL and our advocates come in to help find different ways to educate those who are in the positions of power to make decisions. We speak language policy to people who are able to make decisions that can affect students and affect the way that we are able to build our nation's capacity.
Now, our viewers and listeners are going to be interested in your perspective regarding the state of, I guess, interpreter preparation and proficiency-based language education for this profession. What do you have to say to them about where we are?
Well, I think that right now where we are is behind. We're behind many other countries. We have been for many years, but we are now even in a more dangerous situation as there are decisions being made around education that limit pathways, that limit opportunity, and that limit equitable opportunities for students, for learners. And that's especially true when we talk about interpreters and translators who come with a language, or students who want to become interpreters and translators who come with a heritage or first language. The way that we approach English language learning in this country and multilingual learners in this country is very, very much in danger because of the decisions that are being made. What I would like to point out, of course, is the example of the way that the Department of Education is being dismantled. And one of the most important challenges, one of the most egregious issues, is that the Office of English Language Acquisition, as well as the Office for International and Foreign Language Education, were both closed. They do not exist any longer in the Department of Education. Those are the two departments in the Department of Education that ever dealt with language education. OELA focused on English language learners and multilingual learners and dual language education, was really where Title III and all of the funding that goes along with that was coming from. It's also where the guidance comes from and how our multilingual learners are approached in the educational system. Of course, our other office, which really focused on higher education, was focusing on those study abroad opportunities, as well as the research that surrounds study abroad and language education at higher ed. So we're at a disadvantage right now. And that is one of the issues that JNCL-NCLIS has been focusing on through our words, through our actions. We've been obviously putting out statements, but also really writing letters and taking part in group letters with our partner organizations to Congress and to the Department of Education to demand that there are changes made. In addition to that, we've activated all of our advocates, and that's really what's at the heart of JNCL. Our advocates in every state have been activated, and as of now, we have over 7,000 letters that have been written to Congress, 7,000 messages written to members of Congress from all 50 states about how important it is to reinstate those offices.
So let's talk about Advocacy Day. You recently held an in-person day in the District of Columbia, and now you're planning a virtual Advocacy Day later in October of this year.
Mm-hmm.
Talk to us about the Advocacy Days. How long has JNCL been doing these? I've been seeing the emails for years and years. So tell me what this whole process entails and how we can get interpreters involved.
Well, we've had interpreters involved for years, and I would like to see more interpreters involved, because I really think that what's important to understand is that JNCL-NCLIS's focus is on language education advocacy primarily, and language education access, and of course, language access as a whole. So language advocacy days has been around for many, many years, and it's evolved, right? It's changed over time. Many years ago, it was really just an official delegate from each state or from each member organization, and now it's open to everyone. And what we do at Language Advocacy Days is we bring our advocates together. We do a day of training where they're learning about what our priority pieces of legislation are, what our priority issues are for funding, for appropriations, what are the types of talking points you might want to use, how can we focus this based on with whom they're meeting and what their ideas are. We get them together with other members of their advocacy team from their states, and then we help them see through inspirational conversations and panelists and experts about how they can articulate their messages and use their own personal stories to help influence the way that their legislators understand the issue. And why? Because this following day, everyone who attends Language Advocacy Days comes and goes to Capitol Hill and meets with their members of Congress, with the staffers in their offices. And this is a unique opportunity. This is the piece that our advocates are just delighted by. It's a life-changing experience, I have to say. I remember doing it the first time and feeling like, how am I going to do this? How am I going to be feeling comfortable going up to Capitol Hill and having these conversations? That's where JNCL comes in. We make sure you have all the information. We do even role-playing activities to make sure that everyone feels comfortable and that everyone in each group has the opportunity to share something about their language connection, or at least how it connects to a piece of our legislation that we're supporting or a priority that we're supporting. So that's really where Language Advocacy Days comes from and what the purpose is. It is our signature event every year. And of course, for the last several years, we had to do it online. Once COVID struck, we had to recreate the event and build it online, which is where Language at the Intersection came from. But then this past year in March, we had it in person for the first time in 5 years. And it was really quite significant. It was quite amazing to have everyone come together. What we learned in this process was also that we want to have more than one touch point a year with those legislators. So that's where Advocacy Action Day comes in. And where Language Advocacy Days is a couple of days, what we're doing is Advocacy Action Day is focused on maybe one specific issue that is of utmost importance at that time of year, and having everyone get together. In this year, it will be virtual to meet with their legislators online in October to focus on that issue. It will also include some of that training and some of those other panelists and things that we hope will inspire all of our attendees as well. But again, this is open to everyone. It's really an opportunity to do something that most people don't think about doing, which is to voice your grievances or your concerns or your interests to the people that you vote for.
Now let's talk about some of the bills that you were supporting in April. Tell us about those.
Sure. In March and for the past few years, we've been really focusing on what are the global needs. What I mean by global, is we have to have a collaborative approach to language education because our nation is really hurting because we don't have it, right? As of now, there is no data collection at all for language education in the United States. The Department of Education has never collected any data on language education, which is unusual. Of course, for Title III, there is information collected on English language learners. But so what we talk about is how do we create programs? How do we build pipelines of teachers and qualified teachers? How do we make sure that the students are then recognized for their growth and for their proficiency development? How do we get them abroad to make sure that they have the opportunity to learn and get engaged and immersed in culture? And how do we make sure that we are assessing, having the data and doing the research we need to inform those programs and those decisions? And all of that is a circle, right? So the programs that we focus most on right now we have a piece of legislation called the World Language Advancement and Readiness Act. Well, actually, that's been passed. That is the Department of Defense. That is the one program, K through 12, in the Department of Defense that supports language education, but is only focused on military families or school districts that have a high percentage of military families. Because of the success of that, we introduced World Leap. World Leap is the World Language Education Assistance Program, currently reintroduced in Congress, and it is a bipartisan piece of legislation that would grow grant-based programs in world language and dual language education K through 12. It would articulate that growth, articulate that consistent language education model that our nation needs and that our students deserve. And these small seed grants would allow for our nation to really have a great return on investment. What seems like a large amount of money to you or I, with about $15 million, is really a very small amount for our nation's budget, especially, when we think about the billions and trillions that are spent on other areas. This is something that would change our nation's capacity in graduating students who have a level of proficiency that then can be recognized, which brings up our other piece of legislation, the BEST Act, which focuses on the seal of biliteracy, now available in all 50 states, that would allow for there to be benchmarking and allow for all students to have the opportunity, especially those English language learners, to be benchmarked and then to get recognized through the seal of biliteracy for their proficiency in English and another language. In some cases, those recognitions are for English and multiple other languages. We've seen that happening across the United States as well. But the BEST Act would help facilitate that so that it's not only certain school districts that can afford to do that and afford those assessments. And then, of course, the Paul Simon Study Abroad Act, named for the late Senator Paul Simon, who happened to be one of the members of Congress who was on the Carter Commission that helped yield the development of JNCL-NCLIS. He was a part of that commission. And so this Paul Simon Study Abroad Act would refocus current funds to make sure that universities have the opportunity to broaden the study abroad opportunity so all students have the opportunity to get that experience outside of the country.
Now, I want to explore something that you and I spoke about before the podcast, and it was just this notion that the investment in language education, let's say at a college level, at a high school level, isn't really worth it. I mean, when are you going to use Japanese, or when are you going to use Spanish, other than maybe when you're, at some restaurant or something like that? And I think that there's and I know for a fact I'm one of these people who studied languages at university, and at some point even questioned myself whether or not I would have an actual practical and lucrative use for these languages. Let's talk a little bit about that, because we first have to change our culture before we can change how we educate our children.
It's absolutely true. And I am also one of those people who studied languages in college, right? I studied Romance languages and East Asian studies. And what I know is that the ability to communicate proactively in a connected and very broad way with other people is a skill set that other areas of learning do not explore, frankly. When we think about proficiency development and the modes of communication, we know that every other area of learning doesn't focus on learning through speaking and understanding in the same way that language education does. And so what I want to say about the investment in our nation's investment in language education and in helping to build bilingual and multilingual citizens is that what we are creating in doing that is a nation ready for anything, a nation ready for every career opportunity, for every diplomatic situation, for every type of possibility that can exist, as well as understanding that the small investment yields a very important return on investment that addresses a need. It's a need for the empowerment of the people in our borders who are here in the United States, and it's an empowerment for the businesses and the organizations and all of the people who are looking to globally connect and succeed as well. And so I remember many years ago, I had the opportunity to sit in on a hearing on Capitol Hill. The late Senator Akaka from Hawaii held a hearing about our nation's capability with regard to languages. And it was fascinating to listen to those in government talk about our national security needs, talk about people from business talking about our economic needs, and students from some of the schools in Virginia who were in dual language programs speaking in front of a Senate hearing in Mandarin or in French to demonstrate what they could do in language even at such a young age. And the egregious number of jobs within the government alone that go unfilled because we don't have the language talent that is necessary. And so this is not just a nice to have. Language and proficiency in multiple languages is an essential thing. 9 out of 10 businesses say that they have a demand for multilingual talent. And so many businesses talk about how they miss opportunities in business as a result of not having that connection and not having the people who are able to communicate that way.
So this seal of biliteracy, I understood from you that it's really more of a program for high school students, if I understood correctly. But it seems to me that an extension of this could definitely help our workforce and our economy.
So the seal of biliteracy is really a certification that the states now have through legislation that does focus on K through 12 learners. And what it's done has been incredible because it's helped raise the level of education in the K through 12 environment so that the students, of course, have, in order to achieve the seal of biliteracy, have to achieve a certain level of proficiency. That proficiency is dependent on the instruction. It's dependent on what they get in their districts. And so it's really changed the game for K through 12 students. But in addition to that, there are companies, there are organizations like Major League Baseball, there are all different places, organizations, companies, and really universities and career and technical education institutes as well, that are really looking at certifying the linguistic capabilities of their employees or of their students. And this is really key to what the seal of biliteracy is doing for our nation. It's focusing us on this as an investable, a very really meaningful opportunity for skill building and for demonstrating that skill set in the workplace as well.
So Amanda, how are we seeing the value of language education and language abilities in the marketplace?
Well, in the job market, it's really very interesting. We see it evolving, of course. You can go onto LinkedIn and look at the number of jobs that require certain languages, and you'll see thousands of them in each language. I think there were over 16,000 just for Italian recently when I looked. But what I want to say about what I think is interesting about what's happening in the job market is the incentivizing of multilingualism. And one example is there are certain police departments around the United States that are incentivizing multilingual or bilingual members of their police force. If you join the police force and you come in with a certain level of, and that certain level is dependent on what the department is looking for, and really, if you come in with an understanding and that you are bilingual or multilingual and a proficiency, you get incentives, monetary incentives. Your contract to sign to get started is more than other people. That's what the fact is. And that is happening certainly in medical fields. It is happening, definitely in legal spaces, probably, in courtrooms as well. And in different spaces, we're starting to see that happen more and more, where it is more outwardly said, as opposed to what is maybe just something that is something that they notice about an applicant, right? But now it is really something that is becoming a part of those job descriptions and those advertisements for positions.
So how do we ensure that that proficiency is, I guess, even, across the board, that the concept of fluency for one is not different than for another?
Well, certainly it does require that alignment, right? We do have these ACTFL proficiency guidelines that really help us grow to different levels. There are European guidelines as well, and there are crosswalks for those things. But the seal of biliteracy is a challenge in that each state has a slightly different level. But what those levels mean are the same across the board with regard to an intermediate mid, intermediate high. Those levels are the same. And one of the things that is most important in this understanding is to know how the language is being used. So I think that really what we need to do is continue to do research and collect data. I have been aching for a long time to get some members of Congress to put me in front of one of their business roundtables, because one of the things that we're doing at JNCL and have been for the last year is to develop a business action committee and starting to reach out to large and small businesses around the country to talk about why language matters to them. Why does it matter? Because we know it does. We know that every Fortune 500 company needs multilingual talent, from interpreters to engineers, again, to all the different levels of finance and everything. We know that they need these people, but they're not talking about it. And I think in order to shift culture in the way that you were talking about before, that paradigm shift has to come from really explicit outward conversation that comes from those businesses, that the businesses themselves are saying, we need this, because that's what's going to shift certainly legislator opinions, and I think certainly public opinion as well. So I think it's about collecting data, collecting information, and vocalizing. And that's where I think our advocacy, and even doing things like this, having these conversations, the conversation you and I are having today, is so important. That's really where we make a difference.
Now, it can't be said enough, we are really in challenging times. You made an allusion earlier regarding the English learner offices in the Department of Education. Tell us what the challenges that we have are, and how we can get through them.
Well, certainly many of the executive orders have been challenging. Obviously, the one to dismantle the Department of Education, as well as the English as the official language one, which obviously rescinded another executive order that really required government offices and those receiving government funding to provide information in other languages. The one thing I will say about that, and I do want to clarify, is that executive order and none of the executive orders are law. And this is something that I think it's really important that we restate again and again. They are perspectives from the administration. They are directives that can only really govern certain things. And we continue to see some of that play out in the courts even today regarding some of that. But they're not changing laws. And so remember that there's also not anything prohibiting any of those offices from continuing to do exactly what they've been doing. And it's obviously our hope that in order to adhere to the guidelines of the Civil Rights Act, and of course the ADA, that they will continue to do that exactly. So that's one piece, is the executive orders. The other, of course, is the perspective on education and the Department of Education, and cutting so many grants and so many programs, and even those offices and the personnel in them, to the point where we are crippled to some degree, in order, we're really not able to do the things that we would need to do as a nation for growing even the English learning population, right? Even making sure that our English learners can learn English is a part of that. So we really need to make sure that we are taking the right steps in the space that we're in the constantly changing dynamics of this administration, to inform everyone with clarity, to cautiously be sure that we are protecting what exists, that we are standing up for the rights of our students and of our educators, and also really looking towards helping people understand who are in positions of power what the essential nature of language is to everyone's prosperity and to the economics, the diplomacy, and of course, the day-to-day functionality of our multilingual nation.
I think you mentioned in one of our conversations that multilingualism is not a luxury, that it's a civic, economic, and national security need. I think that says it all, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that's why actually in our transition memo, when the new administration was coming in, our memo really, what we tried to highlight in there was not just the Department of Education and not just the Department of Defense and state, where we know there are some language programs or some offices that deal with language, not enough, and certainly not enough that supports us nationally, but also kind of thinking in terms of the Department of Labor, the Department of Agriculture, and the Department of Health and Human Services, and understanding how language is a factor in all of these spaces. Thinking about apprenticeship programs in the Department of Labor and how language could be and should be an integral key to that apprenticeship experience, especially for students who come in with multiple languages. So to me, it's really a framing of what needs to exist that doesn't in our culture. And that is this paradigm shift, this understanding that language is not something that we can just use to say a few words. As you said, you started this about it not just being about words, but it's about the dynamics of relationships. It's about the dynamics of business. It's about the dynamics of diplomacy. It's about how we take care of each other and ourselves. And it's really not right for our country to not give our students the opportunity to be globally connected in every way and have every opportunity and advantage as every other student in the world has. And that's why language education and language education advocacy are so essential.
Now, JNCL has an advocacy action center.
Yes, we have our Legislative Action Center where anyone can go in and sign up to receive information on anything that's going on in our field, certainly, and anything that that comes up. For example, we have calls to action. I mentioned before that we have over 7,000 letters already going to Congress. I'd love for all of your listeners to go right to our website, languagepolicy.org, and go to our Legislative Action Center and take action. It's very simple. Everything's written out for you. You literally put your name and your information in, and it'll pull up your members of Congress, and we'll send something to them that you can even personalize. And that is exactly what we need to do. We need to continue to raise our voices because we're about to approach budget season, and budgets and appropriations are where the rubber meets the road. This is where it's going to matter because the funding is the crucial piece. If the funding and the legal pieces of this, that the legislation around it is not in place or does not continue, that's where we're going to meet bigger challenges down the road. So we need your voices. And so the Legislative Action Center is a great place to do that. And thank you for mentioning that.
Amanda, thank you so much for joining us here on Subject to Interpretation and sharing your insight and passion for language advocacy. Your work and that of the JNCL-NCLIS is vital to elevating and protecting our profession and essentially the human race.
Thank you so much, Maria. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's a pleasure having you. And I just wanted to, share again your website, which is languagepolicy.org, correct?
Yes. Yes. And we invite all organizations and companies to join us and unite with us because it's our collective voice that will make the difference.
Wonderful. Thank you once again, Amanda. Also to our listeners, thank you so much for tuning in to another episode of Subject to Interpretation. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and share it with others. Until next time, keep advocating for language, language justice, language access, and basically anything that intersects with language. Keep pushing, and most of all, never stop learning. Take care.